Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. Today, I continue to bring you a video centered around the story of Lythieuca and Hùng, a story that may seem ordinary at first glance, yet is filled with deep emotions and unspoken moments of quiet tension. Since the day Duc officially came to live with them, the home Hùng and Lythieuca shared no longer seemed to hold the same sense of peace it once did. There were no major arguments, no harsh accusations, only subtle, almost invisible disruptions, quiet yet persistent, slowly weighing down the atmosphere of the house. Evenings that used to feel warm and comforting, meals once filled with laughter, were now threaded with silence and cautious glances. The conflict began with very small things, details so trivial they hardly seemed worth noticing. A toy placed in the wrong spot, an item both Duc and Tony liked, a fleeting frown on Lythieuca's face when she saw Tony quietly give way, or a brief look of hurt flashing across Duc's young face. Each moment, taken on its own, might have meant nothing. But as they repeated day after day, they gradually accumulated, seeping into every corner of daily life, making emotions more fragile than ever. Lythieuca tried to restrain herself. She understood that Duc was Hung's child from a previous relationship, a boy who had grown up lacking affection, so she constantly reminded herself to be more tolerant, more patient. Yet every time she saw Tony, still so young and unaware, quietly bearing the loss, her heart tightened. These thoughts she never voiced, choosing instead to keep them buried inside, afraid that speaking out would only complicate everything further. As for Duc, the boy carried his own turmoil. Living in a new environment, beside a woman who was not his biological mother and a younger child who seemed to receive constant attention, he tried to appear strong while silently feeling out of place. At times, even a gentle reminder was enough to make him feel like an outsider in his own home. Unable to put those feelings into words, Duc expressed them through his eyes, his attitude, and occasionally through impulsive actions. And then, the moment when Duc pushed Tony became the final straw. As Tony fell, his cry tore through the silence of the house, sending all the long-suppressed emotions surging to the surface. Lythieuca froze, overwhelmed by fear for her child and a pain so deep it caught in her throat. In that instant, she saw not just Tony's fall, but all the worries and insecurities she had tried so hard to hide for so long. Hùng stood there, trapped in a situation he had never imagined he would face. On one side was his biological son, the child he carried a constant sense of guilt and responsibility for. On the other was Lythieuca, the woman he loved, his future wife, and someone who had taken on the role of a mother without sharing blood ties. He wanted to protect his son, yet could not bear to hurt Lythieuca. He wanted to comfort Lythieuca, yet feared Duc would feel abandoned. No one said another word, but the silence at that moment was heavier than any accusation. Lythieuca held Tony close, her heart tightening. Duc stood in a corner, head lowered, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Hùng remained motionless in the middle of the room, a sense of helplessness and exhaustion rising within him, as if everything were slipping beyond his control. That night, the house sank into stillness. Each person carried their own burden, yet no one had the courage to speak. Lythieuca lay awake, thinking about the future and her place within this family. Duc lay quietly, clutching emotions too complex for a child his age to understand. And Hùng, caught in a web of overlapping thoughts, felt his heart grow unbearably heavy as he realized that love, responsibility, and family were sometimes far more complicated than he had ever imagined. The next morning, Duc did not go to school. Under normal circumstances, it would have been an entirely ordinary decision, but given the situation now, it only made everything feel heavier. After the tense night before, Hùng had barely slept. He lay awake until near dawn, his mind spinning with overlapping thoughts. Each time he closed his eyes, the image of Tony falling, the sound of his crying, Lythieuca's wounded gaze, and Duc's bowed, silent figure resurfaced with painful clarity. Hung understood that he was standing between two responsibilities that could not be separated. On one side was his biological son, the child who had only recently returned to him after a long period deprived of affection. On the other was Lythica, the woman he loved, the woman he was preparing to marry, and the one who was trying to shoulder the role of a mother under immense pressure. The more he thought about it, the more he felt he could not afford to make a mistake, yet he had no idea where to begin to make things better. As dawn broke, Hung got up. He prepared quietly, careful not to wake Lythica. His eyes lingered on her exhausted face, and a nameless sense of guilt rose within him. Then he looked at Duc, still asleep, and let out a soft sigh. Leaving the boy at home did not feel right, but work at the office was piling up, urgent files waiting to be handled. After a long moment of hesitation, Hung decided to take Duc with him to work. On the way there, the atmosphere between father and son was subdued. Duc sat beside him, his face unusually solemn, a stark contrast to his usual liveliness. Several times, Hung wanted to speak, to say something to ease the boy's tension, but each time he stopped himself. He was afraid that the wrong words might only make things more awkward. They sat side by side in silence, each carrying their own thoughts, neither reaching into the other's. When they arrived at the office, Hung was quickly pulled into work. Phones rang non-stop, colleagues came and went with questions, stacks of documents waited to be signed. Before diving in, he led Duc to a corner of the room and pulled out a chair for him. Hung handed Duc a few toys brought from home and gave careful instructions. He told the boy to stay seated and not wander around, promising he would come back as soon as he finished his work. His voice tried to remain calm, though a trace of urgency slipped through. Duc nodded and took the toys, but his eyes kept following his father's retreating figure. Even after Hung turned away, the boy continued to stare for a long time, as if afraid that the moment he looked away, his father would disappear. In that moment, no amount of careful instruction could fill the emptiness in the heart of an anxious child. Time passed slowly. Duc sat alone in a space that felt entirely unfamiliar. The surrounding sounds, footsteps, conversations, ringing phones, initially stirred his curiosity, but gradually they became unsettling. He lifted his head and looked around, searching for his father. The spot where Hung had been sitting was now empty, replaced only by stacks of files taller than his line of sight. A sense of panic began to spread. Duc called out for his father, softly at first, as if afraid of disturbing anyone. No one responded. He called again, a little louder this time, but his voice was quickly swallowed by the surrounding noise. Anxiety crept in. His heart beat faster, his hands clenched the toys so tightly they turned pale. Unable to endure being alone any longer, Duc stood up. He thought that just a few steps would be enough to find his father. But the farther he walked, the more unfamiliar everything became. Long hallways, identical doors, busy adults passing by without noticing a confused child. He turned back, but the place where he had been sitting was no longer in sight. Fear truly set in. Duc called for his father instinctively, his voice trembling. There was no answer. He began to walk faster, looking around desperately, hoping to spot a familiar figure. But each step carried him farther from the original workspace. In his confusion, he turned down another corridor without realizing it, completely losing his way. Amid the stream of strangers, Duc suddenly felt smaller and more alone than ever. All the emotions he had been carrying over the past days, the feeling of being unwanted, the insecurity of living in a new family, the fear of losing his father, came crashing down at once. He stopped where he stood, unsure whether to move forward or turn back, knowing only that no one around him was familiar, and his father was nowhere to be found. Near midday, when the workload finally eased, Hung suddenly remembered Duc. He left his desk, thinking simply that his son must still be sitting obediently where he had been told to stay. But the moment he reached the spot, Hung froze. The chair was empty. The toys he had given Duc lay scattered on the floor, untouched, with no one holding them anymore. In that instant, Hung's heart seemed to drop straight into his chest, a chilling sensation spreading rapidly through his body. He stood there for a few seconds, eyes scanning the space around him, hoping he had made a mistake. He called out Duc's name, his voice at first trying to remain calm. There was no reply. He called again, louder, more urgent. Still nothing, only the familiar background noise of the office. Panic truly set in. Hung started running, his footsteps echoing through the hallways as he opened door after door, checking every corner he could think of. He asked everyone he encountered, from close colleagues to people he barely knew. "Have you seen a little boy? Did you see my child around here?" The questions repeated over and over, his voice trembling more each time. But the only answers he received were sympathetic head shakes and surprised, worried looks. No one had seen Duc. No one had noticed when a child had left the area. With every passing minute, Hung's panic multiplied. Sweat broke out across his body despite the cool air. His thoughts spiraled, horrifying possibilities flashing through his mind, each one quickly pushed away by sheer will. He blamed himself mercilessly, blamed himself for being careless, for thinking that a few toys and a few reminders would be enough. He blamed himself for leaving his son alone in a crowded place, where even a moment of inattention could lead to something irreversible. As he ran from floor to floor, his phone kept vibrating in his pocket, but he barely noticed. His hands shook so badly that he could focus on nothing but finding his child. Only when he stopped in a hallway, gasping for breath, did he realize he had missed countless calls. When he looked at the screen, Hoi's name appeared again and again. Another wave of dread rose in his chest. At home, Hoica had been calling Hung repeatedly with no answer. At first, she thought he must be in a meeting, caught up with work. But as the silence dragged on, anxiety burned inside her. Images from the tense night before flooded back, Duc standing with his head lowered, Hung caught between two children, exhausted and torn. Her heart began to pound. A terrible intuition made it impossible for her to stay still. She tried to calm herself, but the harder she tried, the clearer her fear became. Looking at Tony playing nearby, Hoica suddenly felt afraid. She no longer hesitated. She rushed next door to ask a neighbor to watch Tony, spoke only a few hurried words, then turned back to grab her bag. Her movements were quick and decisive, yet her mind was in turmoil. On the way to Hung's workplace, Hoica kept staring out the window. Every minute stretched into what felt like hours. Questions without answers raced endlessly through her mind. She did not know what was happening, did not know why Hung was not answering his phone. She only knew that the sense of unease inside her was growing stronger by the second. When Hoica arrived at the office, she spotted Hung almost immediately. One look at his pale, shaken face, drained by fear, was enough for her to know that something was wrong. She did not ask questions, nor did she offer any blame. All the frustration and hurt from the previous days seemed to fall away. In that moment, only one thought remained. Hoica walked quickly toward Hung and looked straight into his eyes. No words were needed, they understood each other instantly. She gave a silent nod, and together they split up, heading in different directions to search for Duc. Their hurried footsteps echoed throughout the building. They called the boy's name over and over, their voices rising and falling, unable to hide the panic. They ran through hallways, parking areas, and every surrounding space of the office complex. Sweat soaked their backs, their breathing grew ragged. Hoai's heart pounded so hard she could feel every beat. Hung felt the same. Each time he called his son's name and heard no response, it was as if someone were tightening a grip around his chest. In that moment, every misunderstanding, every conflict, every quiet wound that had lingered between them seemed to dissolve. There was no longer a line between his child and hers, no right or wrong, only the overwhelming fear of losing a child. Two people who had stood on opposite sides of emotion were now bound by the same terror, sharing the same racing heartbeat in a vast, uncertain space. Finally, when they were nearly exhausted from searching everywhere, Hoai's suddenly caught sight of a familiar figure near the exit. In a quiet corner where few people passed by, Duc was sitting curled up against the wall, both arms wrapped tightly around his backpack against his chest as a reflexive act of self-protection. His face was pale, his eyes red and swollen from crying too long. His small shoulders trembled, each shallow breath broken and uneven, as if he still had not recovered from the fear he had just endured. In that moment, Hoai's did not have time to think. She rushed forward ahead of Hung, her legs nearly giving way when she saw Duc's condition. She dropped to her knees in front of him and pulled him tightly into her arms. Her embrace was firm, almost desperate, as if loosening her grip even slightly might cause the child to disappear again into the unfamiliar crowd. Duc froze for a brief second, then burst into sobs. The cry spilled out uncontrollably, releasing all the fear and panic he had been holding back. He clutched Hoai's clothes, buried his face against her chest, and through broken breath said that he was terrified, that he couldn't find his father, that he had truly thought his father had abandoned him. Every word trembled, fragile, childlike, carrying the very real fear of a child who had just experienced loneliness and isolation. Hoai's heart tightened painfully as she listened. She raised a hand and gently patted Duc's back, allowing him to cry until he could calm down. In that moment, all memories of the earlier conflicts faded away. There was only a trembling child in her arms, a child longing to be held, longing for reassurance that he had not been abandoned. And it was precisely then that Hoai's understood everything. She realized that Duc had never been a bad child, nor someone who deliberately caused trouble or hurt others. His impulsive actions, his awkward words, even pushing Tony to the ground, all of it came from something simple yet vital, a sense of security he had never truly had. He was just a frightened child, afraid of losing the one person he clung to, unable to express his insecurity in any other way. Hoai's gently loosened her hold and lifted Duc's face. She wiped away the remaining tears on his cheeks, carefully and slowly, as if afraid of hurting him. Her voice softened, no blame, no harshness, only quiet reassurance, short gentle sentences meant to give him a sense of safety. She told him that everything was okay, that they had found him, that he had not been abandoned. Duc looked at Hoai's for a long time. His eyes were still wet, but the panic in them had eased. After a moment of silence, he pressed his lips together and whispered an apology. He apologized for making Tony fall, apologized for saying things that had hurt Hoai's. His voice was small and hesitant, as if he feared that one wrong word could make everything fall apart again. Those apologies were quiet, but they were enough to make Hoai's choke up. She simply nodded, continuing to wipe his tears, her hand resting on his shoulder, a silent assurance that she was there, that she was listening, that she accepted him. Hung stood a short distance away, silently witnessing the entire scene. His throat tightened, as if something were blocking his voice. For the first time, he truly saw the fear in his son's eyes. And for the first time, he realized that much of that pain had not come from anyone else, but from his own haste and helplessness. Hung stepped forward and knelt beside them. He wrapped his arms around Duc, holding him tighter than usual, as if trying to make up for every moment the boy had been alone. Then he turned to Hoai's. In his exhausted eyes, deep remorse was unmistakable. He did not justify himself. He did not explain. He simply apologized, for the first time, his voice low and deliberate, as if every word came from the depths of his heart. On the way home, the three of them spoke very little. Duck sat in the middle, silent, his hands still gripping the strap of his backpack. Hoài sat beside him, occasionally glancing at the boy, while Hung focused on driving, his eyes sometimes flicking to the rearview mirror. The atmosphere in the car was no longer as tense as before, but it was not yet light either. It was the exhaustion that follows a major ordeal, mixed with something new, a quiet sense of understanding beginning to take shape, unspoken, yet already present among the three people sitting side by side. That evening, after everything had gradually settled following a long and turbulent day, the small house sank into a kind of quiet unlike the nights before. It was no longer weighed down by heavy tension, yet not fully warm either, a fragile stillness, where each person was carefully feeling their way through their own emotions. Duck sat alone in a corner of the sofa, his eyes occasionally drifting toward Hoài and Tony. He seemed hesitant for a long time. His hands clenched tightly, then slowly loosened again, as if gathering all his courage for an important decision. After a moment of hesitation, Duck stood up and walked toward them, step by step. Each movement was slow and cautious, as if moving too quickly might cause everything to fall back into how it had been. When he stopped in front of Hoài, Duck lowered his head. His voice was small and trembling, yet clear. He apologized to Hoài once more. It was not a rushed apology or one meant to appease, but an apology spoken after having faced genuine fear. Duck said he would behave better, that he would listen, that he would not make Tony sad again. Then, after a pause, he added that he promised to treat Tony as his own younger brother. Those words made Hoài freeze for a moment. She looked at Duck for a long time, at a face still so young, yet already marked by worry and an effort to grow up too soon. Hoài raised her hand and gently rested it on the boy's head. The gesture was slow and tender, carrying neither pity nor forced responsibility, but a sincere acceptance. Hoài told Duck that from now on, this was home for all three of them. Her voice was calm, not raised, not heavy, just steady enough for him to hear every word clearly. She did not make grand promises, nor did she paint a perfect future. She simply affirmed that he was no longer standing outside this door. Tony sat nearby, still too young to fully understand what was happening, yet he seemed to sense the change in the air. He looked at Duck, then at Hoài, his round eyes wide. Duck bent down and lightly touched Tony's hand. The gesture was awkward, but no longer hesitant. Tony did not cry or react, he simply curled his fingers around Duck's in an unconscious response. Hung stood not far away, quietly watching everything unfold. He did not step forward, did not intervene, he only observed. In that moment, something inside him finally eased. A feeling he had forgotten over time, the feeling of being able to breathe again. Hung realized there were things he could neither force nor arrange according to his will. Family was not something that could be assembled through responsibility or obligation alone. Watching Duck stand before Hoài, watching Tony resting calmly by her side, Hung understood something very clearly. A family does not become whole by itself. It must pass through mistakes, confront the deepest fears of each person, and be generous enough to allow forgiveness if it is to remain together. The wounds that had occurred did not disappear, but how they chose to face them would determine whether they could continue walking forward as one. That night, dinner passed with more silence than words. Yet this silence was no longer heavy. Duck sat properly, occasionally glancing at Tony, then at Hoài. Hoài served food to both children, her movements still slightly tentative, but the invisible distance of earlier days was gone. Hung sat across from them, clearly sensing the small yet genuine shift in the atmosphere of the house. From that day on, Duc officially lived together with Lythica and Tony. There was no solemn declaration, no need for confirmation. He stayed through daily presence, shared meals, evenings spent in the same space. He was no longer labeled the child from another family, no longer an outsider standing awkwardly within a household formed before him. He slowly became a part of this small home, even though that part was still learning how to blend in. Things did not become peaceful overnight. Old habits did not disappear in a single day. Conflicting emotions still existed, they were simply no longer pushed aside through silence or avoidance. All three were learning again how to live beside one another, learning to listen and to accept, even when they felt uncertain or exhausted. And although that evening carried a clear sense of softening, deep down, each of them understood that it was only a small step. The journey toward becoming a true family, one where no one fears abandonment, where no one has to struggle to be accepted, was still a long road stretching ahead.
Xin chào tất cả mọi người đã quay trở lại với kênh của mình. Mình nghĩ là hôm nay mình nên gội đầu tại vì mình thấy cái tóc mái của mình nó khá là bết rồi. Mình đang đặt tên cho cái xem. Tạm biệt mọi người.